Okay, let's dive in. Picture this. A government just absolutely laser focused on crushing a rebellion. So focused, in fact, that it decides to throw nearly two-thirds of its entire army at one single objective.
It's an almost unbelievable concentration of force, really.
Exactly. And it doesn't even stop there. Imagine the leader, the head of state, deciding to temporarily move the entire national capital, not just visit the front, but move the capital city closer to the action, just to personally oversee this one massive military campaign.
That's an extraordinary step.
Mhm.
It speaks volumes about the stakes involved.
Right. It wasn't just strategy, it felt personal. A huge gamble, really, showing this, well, this audacious level of ambition we're going to unpack today. Now, for those of you who've been following along with our series, you'll know we've been tracking this long, grinding conflict between the Ethiopian Derg government and the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, the EPLF.
It's been a complex and often brutal history.
Absolutely, and we've already done deep dives into the first 5 major offensives the Derg launched against the EPLF. Each one was an attempt to kind of deliver a knockout blow in the Eritrean War of Independence.
And each one failed to achieve that ultimate goal.
Precisely. So if you happen to miss those earlier deep dives, we really do recommend going back and having a listen. They set the stage, build the context for just how incredibly tenacious this struggle was.
They really do. Understanding those previous attempts is key to grasping the significance of this next one.
Because today, our focus is squarely on the 6th major offensive. And this one, well, it was unequivocally the biggest, the most ambitious, the Red Star campaign.
Red Star, a name heavy with symbolism.
It really was. And this massive operation played out over several intense months, basically from February through to June of 1982.
A critical period.
So our mission today really is to sift through what we know, through the sources, and pull out the key insights about this huge military effort. We want to look at the tactics, the dramatic events on the ground, some of them pretty brutal,
Absolutely.
and ultimately try and figure out why this seemingly overwhelming force just didn't achieve its goals. And maybe even how it managed to backfire, strengthening the very resistance it wanted to crush.
It's a fascinating question. How does such a disparity in power lead to that kind of outcome?
Exactly. So what does this whole episode tell us about these long, drawn-out conflicts? About, asymmetrical warfare, and maybe just about human resilience itself. Let's get into it.
Okay, so what's really crucial to understand right at the outset is just how much was riding on this for both sides. By early '82, the war had kind of settled into this really tough, grinding stalemate.
Right, things were bogged down.
Pretty much, yeah. The main front line had more or less solidified, and it was largely confined to this one specific, incredibly difficult area, the Sahel region.
Sahel. Tell us about that region. What made it so difficult?
Well, first off, it's huge. We're talking about 26,000 square kilometers.
Yeah.
Roughly the size of, say, Rwanda, or maybe a bit smaller than Maryland in the U.S.
Okay, so a significant area.
Massive. And it's mostly populated by nomads. The terrain itself is just incredibly rugged. Think mountains, deep ravines, wadis, they call them narrow passes. It's classic guerrilla territory.
So naturally favors the defenders.
Absolutely. It gives a smaller, more agile force like the EPLF endless places to dig in, to hide, to set ambushes. It really neutralizes some of the advantages of a larger conventional army.
And right in the middle of all that ruggedness, there was this place, Nakfa. You mentioned it was situated between Karen and Algina. Why was Nakfa so important? It sounds like more than just a location.
Oh, it was far, far more than just a dot on the map. Nakfa was absolutely critical. It served multiple really vital roles for the EPLF.
Like what?
Well, first, functionally, it was the declared headquarters for the Eritrean People's Liberation Army, the EPLA, the EPLS military wing. It was their nerve center. All their planning, their operations were coordinated from there.
The brain of the operation, basically.
Exactly. But beyond that, Nakfa had taken on this powerful, almost mythic status. It became the symbol, the absolute beating heart of the entire Eritrean struggle for independence.
Ah, okay. So it had this symbolic weight, too.
Immense symbolic weight. Think about it. For the Ethiopian government, Nakfa was the primary target. Destroy it, capture it, and maybe, just maybe, you break the enemy's will. It represented everything they were fighting against.
Like a physical manifestation of the rebellion.
Precisely. But for the EPLF, for the Eritrean people, it was the soul of their resistance. It was proof they could hold out against these massive odds. Every time an offensive against Nakfa failed, its symbolic power grew.
So a fight for Nakfa wasn't just about controlling territory.
Not at all. It was a battle for the narrative, for the spirit of the whole independence movement. That's why the Derg was so obsessed with taking it, and why the EPLF defended it so fiercely.
And that obsession really comes through when you look at Mengistu Haile Mariam's personal involvement. You mentioned the stakes were high, but this move in January 82, relocating the national capital to Asmara, that's just extraordinary.
It's almost unprecedented in modern warfare, isn't it? Moving the seat of government to a frontline city right there in Eritrea, basically within striking distance of the fighting.
It wasn't just sending orders from Addis Ababa, he was there.
He was there. It was direct, hands-on, very public oversight. It sent a clear message. This campaign is my absolute priority. Failure is unthinkable.
What kind of pressure does that put on the commanders on the ground, knowing the supreme leader is literally looking over your shoulder?
Immense. Almost unbearable pressure, you have to imagine. It removes any buffer, any distance. Every decision, every setback happens under his direct gaze. And remember, by this point, he'd already concentrated this incredible military force in Eritrea.
Right, the nearly two-thirds of the entire army figure we mentioned.
Yeah, picture that. Around 84,500 combat troops. A colossal force, all focused on this one region, this one objective, and all operating under the intense scrutiny of Mengistu himself, right there in Asmara.
The logistics must have been staggering, just supporting that many troops.
Mind-boggling. And then add the psychological weight of having the leader breathing down your neck. It's a recipe for extreme stress and perhaps extreme measures.
And then came the official announcement. January 25th, Mengistu declares the start of the multifaceted revolutionary campaign. But then he gives it that specific name, Red Star.
Yes, Red Star. And that name wasn't accidental. It was very deliberate political messaging.
How so?
It was direct counterpoint to the planned American military exercises in the Middle East at the time, called Bright Star.
Ah, okay, so it was a Cold War statement.
Absolutely. It was Ethiopia, backed by the Soviet Union, thumbing its nose at the U.S. and its allies. It positioned the campaign not just as an internal matter, but as part of a larger geopolitical struggle, asserting Ethiopia's alignment and its regional ambitions.
And the motto they adopted for Red Star: military victory first and then civic action. That seems pretty stark.
It's incredibly revealing, isn't it? It lays bare their entire strategy, their whole philosophy. First, total military annihilation of the EPLF. Crush them completely. Then and only then bring in the civilian administration, the rebuilding, the political stuff.
No room for negotiation, no hearts and minds approach there.
None whatsoever. It's purely sequential. Military solution first, absolute, and final. It suggests they truly believe they could just wipe the EPLF off the map through sheer force.
And Mengistu's rhetoric matched that, didn't it? The language he used was incredibly hard.
Oh, incredibly dismissive, contemptuous even. He called the EPLF things like anti-freedom, anti-unity, anti-people, and anti-peace bandit gangs.
Wow. Bandit gangs?
Yes. And he confidently predicted their imminent demise, dismissing them as nothing more than the pitiful dregs of history. Strong stuff.
It sounds like more than just military orders. It's psychological warfare, too.
Definitely. It served two purposes. One, to boost the morale of his own troops, make them believe victory was inevitable, maybe even dehumanize the enemy. Two, to demoralize the EPLF, to try and break their spirit before the fighting even ramped up, strip them of legitimacy.
But that kind of rhetoric, that level of personal investment from the leader, it raises the stakes so high, doesn't it? What happens if reality doesn't match the pronouncements?
Exactly. It's a classic trap. When you make such absolute statements, when you stake your personal prestige on a swift, decisive victory, anything less than that becomes a massive failure. Not just a military setback, but a personal and political humiliation for the leader and the regime.
And it sets this expectation of immediate success, which might not be realistic against a determined, well-dug-in opponent.
Precisely. Especially in that kind of terrain. The gap between the confident rhetoric and the grinding reality of the battlefield can be absolutely devastating for morale and for the regime's credibility.
Okay, let's talk about the forces involved, because the difference in numbers and equipment is just staggering. You said Mengistu had 10 divisions.
10 divisions, yeah. Totaling 84,537 combatants, a huge number. And the equipment backing them up was designed for exactly what they planned. Overwhelming force.
What kind of firepower are we talking about?
Well, think modern, Soviet-supplied gear for the era. 55 aircraft that includes powerful Antonov transports and MiG fighters for ground attack.
Okay, significant air power.
Definitely. Then on the ground, 131 tanks, 162 armored cars, 102 infantry fighting vehicles. For artillery support, 499 field artillery pieces.
Theoretically 500 guns.
Yeah, for massive barrages. Plus 48 rocket launchers, including those feared Katyushas, the BM-21 Grads.
Stalin's organs.
The very same. Then 873 mortars. And interestingly, 691 anti-aircraft guns.
Anti-aircraft guns, why so many? Were they expecting EPLF air power?
Not really. The sources suggest they were often repurposed, used in a direct fire role against EPLF positions dug into hillsides, just blasting away at fortified bunkers.
Wow. Okay, what else?
Add to that 1,349 anti-tank guns and 7,714 heavy machine guns. It's just an incredible amount of firepower concentrated in one place.
It really is hard to picture. Now, contrast that with the EPLF. What did they have?
Much, much leaner. They were primarily a guerrilla force, remember. About 22,184 fighters.
Okay, so roughly a 4-to-1 disadvantage in manpower.
Around that, yeah. And the equipment disparity was even starker. They had captured or acquired some heavier gear, but far less. 19 tanks.
19 versus over 130.
Exactly. 31 armored cars compared to 162. Only 28 field artillery pieces versus nearly 500. 162 mortars against almost 900. 45 anti-aircraft guns versus almost 700. 387 anti-tank guns versus over 1,300. And 384 heavy machine guns versus over 7,700.
The numbers are just jaw-dropping. It paints this picture of a David versus Goliath scenario, but maybe even more extreme.
It truly does. The sheer numerical and material superiority of the Ethiopian side was overwhelming. And that really sets up the central question for this whole campaign, doesn't it?
Which is?
How on earth does a smaller, vastly outgunned force, mostly guerrillas, manage to first withstand and then ultimately repel such a massive modern military machine? That's the puzzle. That's the story of Red Star.
Okay, so the offensive kicks off February 15th, 1982. How did it begin? Was it as coordinated as they hoped?
It certainly started that way. The Ethiopians launched their attacks simultaneously on 3 different fronts.
3 fronts. Why?
The clear strategy was to stretch the EPLF defenses, force them to divide their smaller number of fighters and resources across a wider area, hoping to punch through somewhere or overwhelm them everywhere at once.
Makes sense, divide and conquer.
Exactly. And the sources suggest it began with this real air of readiness and supreme confidence. They believed their plan was solid, their forces were ready, and success depended on that precise coordination between all the units on all 3 fronts.
And did they achieve that coordination initially?
For the first 72 hours, it seems they did. There was real momentum. The reports say all commands seamlessly advanced toward their respective targets.
So the plan was working.
Initially, yes. The air power was crucial. Those Antonovs and MiGs were just relentlessly pounding EPLF positions, trying to soften them up. Meanwhile, the ground troops, the mobile units and armored columns, were pushing forward, converging on plateaus, moving up these narrow valleys, trying to overrun the defenders with speed and firepower.
It must have been terrifying for the EPLF defenders. The noise, the sheer force.
Unimaginable. A true display of modern military power being unleashed. But, and this is crucial, even with all that power, the terrain itself was still a major factor.
The mountains and passes we talked about.
Exactly. It inherently favored the defenders. It meant the Ethiopians often had to attack simultaneously from the front, the flanks, sometimes even the rear, just to try and dislodge these dug-in guerrilla positions.
So it wasn't easy going, even with the firepower.
No. And despite that initial rapid progress, despite the heavy bombing, the EPLF guerrillas knew their ground. They used their fortifications effectively, and they held on.
They didn't break.
They didn't break. And by the 4th day, that initial Ethiopian momentum started to stall. The drive lost steam. It threw the attackers off balance, as one source puts it.
Just 4 days in? That seems quick for such a huge operation to lose momentum.
It is quick. And it was a really significant sign. It showed that even this meticulously planned, overwhelmingly powerful offensive was hitting serious friction. It suggested that sheer force might not be enough against that kind of resistance in that kind of terrain. It was the first crack in the Ethiopian confidence.
And that friction, that slowdown, it seems it quickly turned into something much worse for the Ethiopians, especially on the Western Front.
Yes, the Western Front saw a really dramatic and brutal reversal very early on. Initially, things looked good for the Ethiopians there, too. You had Major General Mebrek commanding 3 divisions, plus the Sintik Mechanized Brigade, plenty of air support.
So, a powerful force.
Very. And they did achieve their initial objectives. They pushed forward, captured ground, just like on the other fronts in those first few days. But before they could really dig in, before they could consolidate those gains, the EPLF hit back. Hard. A powerful, coordinated counterattack.
So the EPLF didn't just defend, they attacked back.
Absolutely, and very effectively. We have some specifics on the timing here. By mid-morning on February 16th, just the second day, remember the Ethiopian 21st Division took Kir. The 24th Division took some key heights. Other units, like the 37th Brigade and Paracommandos, also captured their initial targets. So on paper, it looked like textbook success.
Okay, sounds like the plan unfolding.
It did. But then, almost immediately after taking Kir, the 21st Division just got smashed.
Smashed? How?
The EPLF apparently executed this brilliant tactical maneuver. They essentially lured the 21st Division forward, possibly into a free-prepared killing zone or just a position where they were vulnerable, and then they sprung the trap.
An ambush on a division scale.
Seems like it, or something very close. The result was catastrophic for the Ethiopians. The 21st Division was forced into this rapid, probably chaotic retreat all the way back to Alphabet. It was a stunningly fast reversal.
Wow. Just like that, their initial gains were wiped out.
Wiped out, and worse. And this setback leads to one of the most chilling incidents of the whole campaign.
What happened?
The blame for this disaster fell squarely on the commander of the 21st Division, a Colonel Wumashet Mamo.
Okay.
And the consequence, handed down presumably with Mengistu's approval, if not direct order, was swift and brutal. Colonel Mamo was executed, publicly, in front of his own troops.
Executed for a tactical defeat in front of his men.
Executed in front of his men. It's horrifying, but it tells you everything about the pressure cooker environment, the absolute ruthlessness of the Derg regime, and the sky-high stakes Mengistu had set. Failure wasn't just punished, it was met with death.
That sends a terrifying message through the ranks.
It absolutely does. Imagine being a commander after hearing about that. Does it make you fight harder? Or does it make you terrified of taking any risks? Does it make you more likely to, falsify reports to avoid blame?
It sounds like it would breed fear more than discipline, a culture of terror.
History suggests that's often the case. Fear can paralyze initiative. Commanders might become overly cautious, or worse, make reckless decisions out of desperation to avoid failure, rather than sound tactical judgment. It's a corrosive environment for any military.
Just brutal. And while this was happening on the Western Front, what about the North? You said they had some initial success there, too.
They did. On that same day, February 16th, the Ethiopian 15th Division managed to capture a place called Jebel Dambobiet. And crucially, working with the 23rd Division, they succeeded in cutting the EPLF supply lines coming in from Sudan.
Okay, that sounds significant. Cutting supplies could cripple the EPLF, right?
Potentially, yes. Isolating them from external support, from weapons, ammo, food.
Yeah.
That was a major strategic goal for the Ethiopians. It was a serious blow, a real achievement for them on the Northern Front.
Did it last?
No. Once again, the EPLF reaction was incredibly swift and effective. Just 2 days later, on the 18th, they launched a counterattack.
Against the 15th Division.
Yes. And it forced the 15th to retreat from Jebel Dambobiet, reopening those vital supply lines.
Wow, they reversed that game quickly.
Very quickly. Yeah. And they didn't stop there. The EPLF then turned their focus onto the 23rd Division, pushing them back as well. Essentially, within a couple of days, the Ethiopian army had lost all the ground they had gained on the Northern Front.
So another front where initial success evaporated almost immediately.
Exactly. It just demonstrates, again, the EPLF's tactical flexibility, their ability to react fast, concentrate their forces where needed, and regain the initiative, even when facing what looked like a strategic setback, like having their supply lines cut. They didn't just hold the line, they pushed back effectively.
Okay, so the West and North fronts saw these rapid reversals. What about the Southern Front? You said that started promisingly for Ethiopia, too.
It did. This might have been where the Ethiopians came closest to a real breakthrough. The assault here was led by the 3rd and 17th Divisions, and initially they achieved what sources call impressive results.
How so? What did they do differently here?
Well, the 17th Division in particular pulled off a really clever maneuver. They started advancing towards Algina, moving parallel to the coast. This looked like their main objective.
A feint.
Exactly. Because then, suddenly, they executed this sharp left turn, inland. The sources praised their extraordinary speed and tactical efficiency. It was a surprise flanking attack.
Catching the EPLF off guard.
Completely off guard. And they hit them hard. This wasn't just infantry. They unleashed a massive barrage. Mortars, heavy artillery, and those Soviet Katyusha rocket launchers, Stalin's organs.
The sound must have been terrifying.
Terrifying and devastating. On top of the rockets and artillery, they had helicopter gunships providing close air support, plus ongoing strikes from fighter jets. It was a full-spectrum assault concentrated on the EPLF's flank.
What was the impact on the EPLF?
The sources suggest it was brutal. Caught by surprise under this intense, multi-pronged attack, the Eritreans likely suffered very heavy losses here. One account suggests it might have been their heaviest casualties thus far in the entire war.
A really critical moment, then.
Absolutely. This was potentially devastating for the EPLF. And the 17th Division pressed its advantage. They seized a key strategic point called Rorus Salim.
Why was Rorus Salim important?
Taking it effectively cut the link between the EPLF forces in the northern part of the front and those in the south. It fragmented their defensive line, making it harder for them to reinforce each other.
Okay, so a major tactical victory for the 17th.
A huge victory. And from Rorus Salim, they didn't stop. They pushed on directly towards Nakfa, the ultimate prize. They were fighting off counterattacks constantly, day and night, but it kept advancing.
How close did they get?
Astonishingly close. By February 18th, remember, the offensive only started on the 15th. The 17th Division was reportedly within just 3 kilometers of Nakfa.
3 kilometers, that's basically right there. The symbolic heart of the resistance was almost within their grasp.
It was arguably the high water mark for the Ethiopians in the entire Red Star campaign. The moment they came closest to achieving that decisive breakthrough, to capturing the enemy's headquarters. You can only imagine the tension, the desperation on both sides at that point.
It feels like the EPLF was on the brink, but they didn't break, did they?
They bent, perhaps severely, but they absolutely did not break. Even facing this disaster, even with the 17th Division practically knocking at Nakfa's door, the EPLF spirit held. And more than that, they found a way to counterattack yet again.
How? They must have been reeling.
They must have been. But somehow they regrouped. They attacked the Ethiopian forces that were pushing into the hills around Nakfa. And crucially, through what must have been incredibly daring reconnaissance under fire, they identified a gap, a weakness in the Ethiopian front line.
A gap, even with that huge army.
It seems so. Maybe the advance was too fast, maybe coordination broke down, maybe the terrain created unforeseen openings. Whatever the reason, the EPLF found it.
Exploited it.
Brilliantly. They used that gap to launch another outflanking operation, this time against the Ethiopian 3rd Division, the other prong of the southern assault.
So they flanked the flankers, in a way?
Not quite the flankers, but the other main attacking force on that front. This maneuver put intense pressure on the 3rd Division, forcing it to begin pulling back, initially in an orderly way.
Okay, so that relieved some pressure. What about the 17th, the ones near Nakfa?
They were now in serious trouble. While the 3rd Division was being pushed back, the 17th tried desperately to hold its advanced position near Nakfa, engaging the EPLF in fierce mountain fighting. But the EPLF's pressure, perhaps combined with the 3rd Division's withdrawal, was too much. The 17th Division found itself completely encircled.
Wow, from being 3 kilometers from victory to being surrounded, that's another incredible reversal.
A dramatic turnaround.
Yeah.
The hunter became the hunted. Now, they weren't wiped out immediately. The Ethiopians managed to send in 2 battalions from the 38th Brigade to relieve the encircled 17th.
They broke through.
They did manage to open a path, allowing the battered 17th Division to retreat. But the EPLF didn't let up. They pursued them. They pursued the withdrawing 3rd Division.
They kept the pressure on.
Relentlessly. By March 5th, less than 3 weeks after the offensive began, the EPLF caught up to the main body of the retreating 3rd Division, hit its left flank hard, and forced it to withdraw all the way back to where it had started before the offensive even began.
So all those initial impressive results on the southern front, completely erased.
Completely erased. The Ethiopians were back to square one on that front, having suffered heavy losses and achieved nothing lasting.
And what about the commander of the 3rd Division, given what happened to Colonel Mamo?
Tragically, we see a grim parallel. The commander of the 3rd Division, facing the same reality, catastrophic failure, the loss of potentially thousands of his men, and undoubtedly fearing the same fate as Colonel Mamo. He committed suicide.
Oh, no. So execution on one front, suicide on another.
Yes. These repeated instances, this pattern of commanders facing either execution or suicide after major setbacks, it just hammers home the unbearable pressure cooker Mengistu had created. The psychological toll must have been immense. It really makes you question the effectiveness of leadership through sheer terror. Does it work? Or does it just lead to more tragedy and dysfunction?
It sounds like it mostly led to tragedy here, but even with these huge failures on all 3 fronts, the commanders dead or disgraced, massive casualties, the Ethiopians didn't just pack up and go home.
No. And this speaks volumes about the top-down nature of the campaign, driven by Mengistu's personal will. Despite the evidence of failure, despite the horrific cost, the Derg regime simply refused to concede defeat. They kept pushing.
They doubled down.
They did. There was another major push later in the spring. On May 16th, the 21st and 22nd Divisions, despite the earlier disasters, were ordered south again. Objective, capture Nakfa.
Another direct assault on the main prize.
Exactly. They hadn't given up on the idea that taking Nakfa was the key. They even tried some, well, desperate-sounding deception tactics.
Like what?
Parachuting dummies behind EPLF lines.
Dummies! Seriously?
Yes. The idea, presumably, was to draw EPLF fire, make them reveal their positions, maybe trick them into thinking there was an airborne assault happening in their rear, forcing them to divert troops. A classic, if perhaps outdated tactic against seasoned guerrillas.
Did it work?
The sources don't suggest it had much impact. The main action was the ground assault. The 21st Division moved towards a place called Kubkub to seize Amba Peak, while the 22nd launched a frontal assault on a heavily fortified position known as Hill 782.
Hill 782. Sounds ominous.
It clearly was a key defensive point for the EPLF, heavily dug in. And this is where the desperation of the Ethiopian command becomes truly apparent, leading to a particularly grim episode.
What happened on Hill 782?
To try and take this heavily defended summit, the Ethiopian command summoned units known as Volunteers of Death.
Volunteers of Death. What does that mean?
It implies exactly what it sounds like. Units, perhaps composed of ideologically motivated soldiers, or maybe just regular troops given an impossible task, ordered to make suicidal human wave-style attacks. They were told to fight their way to the top of Hill 782 in fierce close fighting and hand-to-hand combat.
My God, just sending men to die against machine guns and bunkers.
It seems that way. It shows the extreme lengths they were willing to go to, the utter disregard for their soldiers' lives by this point, just to achieve a breakthrough against this incredibly stubborn EPLF defense.
And the outcome for these volunteers?
Predictably horrific. Despite whatever bravery they showed, they were virtually annihilated in the fighting for Hill 782, cut down by the entrenched EPLF defenders.
That's just sickening, a truly harrowing glimpse into the brutality and futility of that stage of the campaign.
It really is. It encapsulates the desperation, the waste of life, and the sheer determination of the EPLF defense. Even facing literal suicide squads, they held their ground.
And even after that disaster, after the Volunteers of Death were wiped out, the Ethiopians still weren't done.
Unbelievably, no. There was one more major push. The fourth and final assault of the Red Star campaign came in June 1982.
What was the objective this time? Still Nakfa?
Still Nakfa. The 15th Division, which had been pushed back on the northern front earlier, was moved south to make another attempt at seizing the town. Same result. They were repeatedly beaten back. The EPLF defenses around Nakfa just proved unbreakable.
So that was finally it.
That was finally it. By July 5th, 1982, after nearly 5 months of relentless, bloody fighting, the Ethiopian army officially stopped its offensives. The order came down. Stop attacking. Start digging in. Consolidate defensive positions.
Wow. So the Red Star campaign didn't end with a bang, but with digging trenches.
Essentially, yes. It petered out not in victory, not even in a negotiated ceasefire, but in exhaustion and stalemate, forcing the attackers into a defensive posture. It was a quiet, almost anticlimactic end to such a grandly announced, ambitious offensive. And that itself speaks volumes.
It really does. Ending not with victory, but with entrenchment is a pretty clear sign of failure for the side that started the offensive.
It's a tacit admission that the objectives could not be achieved, at least not with the available means or will, after pouring in so much blood and treasure.
Let's talk about that cost, the aftermath. The casualties must have been enormous.
Devastating, particularly for the Ethiopian side that threw so much manpower into the meat grinder. The figures we have suggest 10,115 Ethiopian soldiers killed.
Over 10,000 killed.
Plus 23,313 wounded, and another 3,159 listed as missing.
So if you add that up, that's over 36,000 casualties in one campaign.
Over 36,000 casualties for the Ethiopian army. A truly staggering number, enough to seriously impact the fighting capacity of multiple divisions.
What about the EPLF? They must have suffered heavy losses too, defending against that onslaught.
They definitely did. The EPLF acknowledged around 4,000 of their fighters were killed. And typically in that kind of warfare, the number wounded is significantly higher, perhaps 3 times as many. So maybe around 16,000 total casualties for the EPLF.
Still very heavy losses for a smaller force.
Absolutely. A significant blow. But when you compare the ratios, considering the Ethiopians started with a nearly 4-to-1 advantage in fighters and vastly superior firepower, the fact that they suffered more than double the EPLF's casualties is incredibly telling.
It really highlights the effectiveness of the EPLF's defense and tactics, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It
Yeah.
speaks to their tactical skill, their knowledge of the terrain, their motivation, and the strength of their fortifications. They absorbed this massive blow and inflicted disproportionately heavy losses on a much larger, better-equipped enemy.
So, beyond the horrific human cost, what was the strategic outcome? Did Ethiopia gain anything?
Strategically, virtually nothing. Despite all the fighting, all the initial gains that were then lost, the sources conclude the government made no significant gains in Eritrea. They failed to take Nakfa. They failed to destroy the EPLF. They failed to break the stalemate. They essentially ended up back where they started, only significantly weaker.
And politically, what was the impact?
This is where it gets really interesting and where the unintended consequences kick in. Mengistu's goal was to crush the Eritrean will to resist.
Right. Military victory first.
But the opposite happened. The failure of this massive high-profile campaign actually strengthened Eritrean resolve. Seeing the EPLF withstand the Derg's biggest punch, seeing them survive Red Star, it apparently prompted the Eritrean people to rally behind the EPLF with even increased fervor.
Wow. So the attempt to crush them actually made them stronger politically and psychologically.
It seemed so. It became a rallying cry. Proof that resistance was possible, that even Mengistu's mightiest effort could be defied. It was a massive psychological victory for the EPLF, born from withstanding a military onslaught.
And for Mengistu himself, all that personal investment, moving the capital, this must have been a huge blow.
A massive personal and political blow, as the sources put it. He had staked so much on Red Star. His pronouncements, his presence in Asmara, it was all geared towards a decisive victory. And it ended in a bloody, undeniable failure. His image as an invincible leader, a brilliant strategist, took a serious hit.
Was there any follow-up? Did they just give up after Red Star failed?
Not entirely.
Yeah.
The failure was clearly recognized within the Derg, though perhaps not publicly admitted in full. As a result of the poor performance, they did launch another operation the following August, called Red Star 2.
Red Star 2. Did they try again on the same scale?
No, and this is very telling. Red Star 2 kept a much lower profile than the original. No big announcements, no capital moves, no predictions of imminent demise.
A tacit admission of failure.
It certainly looks that way. A quiet, less ambitious follow-up suggests they understood the previous campaign had been a disaster and perhaps lacked the resources or the political will for another gamble on that scale immediately afterwards.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? That whole cycle. A massive campaign launched to destroy an enemy, fails spectacularly, and ends up making that enemy stronger and more determined.
It's a recurring pattern in many protracted conflicts and insurgencies throughout history. Overwhelming force that isn't strategically or politically smart can often backfire, hardening resistance rather than breaking it.
So let's try and wrap this up. The Red Star campaign, the sixth, biggest offensive by the Derg against the EPLF, designed to be the knockout blow.
An epic undertaking, fueled by Mengistu's ambition and backed by overwhelming military might.
Yet despite all that, the numbers, the tanks, the planes, the brutal tactics like the volunteers of death, it ended in strategic failure.
Utter failure to achieve its objectives, accompanied by staggering casualties, especially for the Ethiopians.
And perhaps the most surprising outcome. It didn't crush Eritrean resolve, it actually strengthened it.
Galvanizing support for the EPLF, turning a military defense into a profound political and moral victory for the resistance.
So this deep dive really paints a powerful picture, doesn't it? About how things like terrain, leadership, both good and bad, maybe the psychological impact of terror versus resilience.
And critically, just that raw human will to resist. How all those factors can combine to defy even what looks like insurmountable military power.
The personal costs were immense, the strategic mistakes clear, but the tenacity of the EPLF is undeniable. It really is a compelling story for anyone trying to understand these long, drawn-out struggles.
Absolutely. A vital case study in asymmetrical warfare and the limits of conventional military solutions against a determined insurgency rooted in the population and the terrain.
And remember, this was the sixth major offensive. As we finish this deep dive today, there's still one more major chapter in this conflict that we'll explore in our series, the one that ultimately leads to the final resolution of this long, defining struggle.
That final phase will bring its own complexities and dramatic turns.
Definitely. But the story of Red Star leaves us with a really potent question to think about, doesn't it?
It really does.
When does sheer military power, just the weight of numbers and technology, become, well, almost irrelevant, or even counterproductive, especially when it's facing an unyielding spirit of people determined not to be broken What does it actually take to conquer not just land, but the will of a people?